At 71, I thought the worst betrayal would come from strangers, not from Matthew, Diane, and Michael, the 3 children I raised and sacrificed everything for. When they showed up at my door with fake smiles and coffee cake, the same cake I baked when Matthew earned his first diploma, I had no idea they were about to steal my $875,000 home and dump me in a nursing home as if I were trash. What they didn't know was I was planning my escape the moment they walked in. But here's what they didn't count on. I wasn't some helpless old woman. I even wore my sassiest slippers that day, though nobody appreciated my fashion sense. I was a mother scorned, and by the time I was done, they'd be begging for mercy. The revenge I orchestrated made national news and left them financially destroyed. But before I tell you how I brought them to their knees, let me show you exactly what they tried to steal from me. The perfect setup. My life at 71 was exactly what I dreamed of during those lean years when Harold and I were building our future. Every morning I'd wake up in our Victorian home on Maple Street, the house we'd paid off over 30 years of sacrifice and double shifts. Harold worked at the steel plant while I took in sewing to make ends meet. We painted every room ourselves and planted the oak tree in the front yard that now towered over the entire street. The house had become worth $875,000, according to the latest assessment, a number that still shocked me every time I saw it on the tax bill. My savings account had grown to over $400,000 through careful investments and Harold's pension, money I'd planned to leave to the kids. I maintained the same routine Harold and I had shared for decades. Up at 6:30, coffee on the back porch, then a walk through the neighborhood. I even alphabetized my spices, by the way. Nerdy, I know, but it kept me organized. The first strange conversation happened 3 months before everything fell apart. Matthew called on a Sunday evening asking detailed questions about my health insurance and whether I felt comfortable managing my finances. I brushed off his concerns, telling him I was sharper than most people half my age. 2 weeks later, Diane dropped by unannounced with homemade cookies and casually asked if I ever felt lonely in such a big house, whether I'd considered downsizing. I told her I loved my home and had no intention of leaving it, but I caught her taking pictures of the living room when she thought I wasn't looking. Michael started calling twice a week instead of his usual monthly check-in, asking about my memory and whether I'd been getting confused about dates. When I mentioned misplacing my car keys one morning, he made a big deal about it, suggesting I might want to have my doctor check for early signs of dementia. The phone calls between my children increased dramatically. I'd answer to hear one of them quickly end conversations with someone else. David would call Tuesday evening. Then Sarah would call Wednesday morning asking the exact same questions about my health and daily routine. Mark would follow up Thursday with concerns about my driving and whether I felt safe living alone. I began noticing things that made me uncomfortable. Matthew asked for a spare key to check on the house when I was out of town. Diane offered to help organize my important papers and seemed particularly interested in my financial documents. Michael suggested I should give one of them power of attorney just in case something happened. They presented these suggestions as loving concern, but the timing felt coordinated. The house had attracted attention from real estate agents who left cards in my mailbox almost weekly. The young couple next door had sold their place for $820,000 after living there only 5 years. Every time I mentioned these unsolicited offers to my children, they'd exchange glances and ask detailed questions about the agents and the amounts mentioned. I prided myself on staying mentally sharp and physically active. I balanced my checkbook to the penny every month, managed my own investments, and drove myself everywhere without incident. I read voraciously, completed crossword puzzles daily, and could recall details about my grandchildren's activities better than their own parents. My doctor had pronounced me in excellent health for my age during my last physical. The turning point came on a Thursday afternoon when I returned from the library to find my desk drawer slightly ajar. I kept my financial documents in a specific order, and someone had been through them. Bank statements were shuffled, my investment portfolio was out of place, and my insurance papers had been moved. Someone with a key had been in my house going through my private papers. That evening, Matthew called with unusual urgency in his voice. He said he'd been talking to Diane and Michael about their concerns regarding my welfare. They decided as a family that I needed more support, and they wanted to discuss options for my care. When I told him I was perfectly capable of caring for myself, he mentioned specific incidents that I'd shared with them in confidence. Diane called the next morning repeating similar concerns. She'd researched assisted living facilities in the area and wanted to take me on tours of a few places. Not because I needed to move immediately, she assured me, but so we could plan ahead. Her voice carried the same rehearsed quality I'd heard from Matthew. The final warning came that weekend when I overheard Michael talking quietly on his phone in my kitchen while I was in the garden. He mentioned my house's value, discussed timing, and said something about making the transition as smooth as possible. When he saw me through the window, he quickly ended the call and came outside to compliment my roses. Monday morning brought the call. That changed everything. Matthew's voice was formal, almost businesslike, when he said they needed to have a serious family discussion about my living situation. All three of them were coming over Tuesday afternoon. This wasn't a request or an invitation for input. He'd already spoken to Diane and Michael, and they'd made decisions that required my cooperation. I spent Monday night unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling and replaying every conversation, every strange question, every suspicious glance. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture I didn't want to see. My own children had been building a case against me, gathering evidence of my supposed incompetence, planning something that would change my life forever. But none of that prepared me for what they were about to deliver. The ambush. They arrived at precisely 2:00, like a corporate takeover team executing a hostile acquisition. Matthew walked through my front door carrying a leather briefcase that looked expensive and official. Diane followed with a manila folder thick with documents, her heels clicking against my hardwood floors with military precision. Michael came last, closing the door behind him with the finality of a prison gate. No acknowledgement of the coffee cake I'd left cooling on the counter. Matthew set his briefcase on my dining room table and opened it with practiced efficiency. The sound of the latches clicking open reminded me of a judge's gavel. He pulled out a stack of papers that had clearly been prepared by attorneys, each page marked with colored tabs and sticky notes. Diane arranged her folder beside his, revealing medical forms and what looked like facility brochures. Michael positioned himself near the doorway, blocking my exit like a security guard. Diane spoke first, her voice taking on the patronizing tone people use with confused children. She'd researched my condition extensively and consulted with medical professionals about the warning signs I'd been displaying. My forgetfulness had progressed beyond normal aging, she explained, and my recent episodes of confusion indicated cognitive decline that required immediate intervention. The morning I'd left my car keys in the refrigerator became proof of dangerous confusion. The time I'd forgotten to turn off the stove after making dinner became evidence that I was a safety hazard. The minor fender bender from months ago, where another driver had rear-ended me at a red light, became a sign that I was an unsafe driver putting others at risk. Every normal human mistake had been cataloged and transformed into ammunition against my independence. Matthew opened a medical file they'd compiled without my knowledge. They documented every phone call where I'd seemed tired or distracted. They'd noted the times I'd asked them to repeat something or when I'd struggled to remember a neighbor's name. Normal aging had become pathological in their careful documentation. Michael produced photographs they'd taken during recent visits. Pictures of dishes in my sink became evidence that I couldn't maintain basic hygiene. A stack of mail on my counter proved I was neglecting important correspondence. They'd been building a case against me for months, collecting evidence like detectives investigating a crime scene. Diane pulled out brochures for Sunset Gardens, a memory care facility 30 minutes away. She described it like a resort, emphasizing the professional staff and structured activities. The facility specialized in residents with cognitive decline, she explained, and they'd already toured it extensively. The staff was expecting me, the paperwork was completed, and they'd secured a private room. Everything had been arranged without my input or consent. Matthew revealed the financial arrangements they'd made on my behalf. The monthly cost was substantial, but they'd calculated that my savings and Social Security would cover it for several years. They'd spoken to financial advisors about liquidating some of my investments. The house would need to be sold to provide for my extended care needs, they explained, presenting it as the only responsible option. The power of attorney document I'd signed after my minor surgery last year had given them authority I hadn't realized. I trusted Michael when he said it was temporary, just for medical decisions while I recovered from having my gallbladder removed. The grogginess from the anesthesia had made everything seem reasonable at the time. But now they claimed it covered more than healthcare decisions, though I remembered specifically asking that it only apply to medical matters. Every protest I raised was met with condescending explanations. When I insisted I was perfectly capable of living independently, Diane reminded me about the stove incident. When I argued that my mind was sharp, Matthew mentioned my confusion about which day the garbage was collected. When I demanded they respect my wishes about my own life, Michael suggested that my anger was evidence of the cognitive changes they'd been observing. They'd rehearsed responses to every argument I might make. My desire to stay in my home became unrealistic attachment to the past. My anger about their interference was emotional instability. My insistence on making my own decisions was evidence that I lacked judgment to recognize my declining capabilities. The revelation about the house sale hit me like a physical blow. Diane explained that maintaining the property was beyond my current abilities, and the expenses were eating into my care fund. They'd already consulted with a realtor who specializes in estate sales. The market was strong, and houses in my neighborhood were selling quickly above asking price. Matthew opened his briefcase again and showed me the listing agreement they'd prepared. Professional photographs had already been taken, he explained, and the house would go on the market within the week. They'd hired an estate sale company to handle my belongings, keeping only items that would fit in my new living space. Decades of memories would be sold to strangers or donated to charity. When I asked about Harold's and my wedding photo, the black and white portrait that had sat on my dresser for 46 years, Diane's voice cracked slightly as she said there wouldn't be room for such large frames. My voice broke when I realized they weren't allowing me to take the one thing that connected me most to Harold. That photograph had watched over our bedroom through every joy and sorrow of our marriage. Michael assured me this was the best solution for everyone involved. I'd receive professional care. They'd have peace of mind knowing I was safe, and the proceeds from the house would fund my long-term needs. He spoke about visiting me regularly and maintaining our close family relationships, painting a picture of comfortable retirement that ignored everything I'd told them about my wishes. Diane checked her watch and announced that we needed to leave for the facility within the hour. My room was ready, the staff was expecting me, and they'd scheduled meetings with the medical team. She'd packed a suitcase with essentials while I'd been out at the library earlier that week. The systematic destruction of my autonomy was complete. They'd manipulated my trust, exploited my temporary vulnerability after surgery, and used my love for them against me. The children I'd raised had become strangers willing to sacrifice my happiness for their financial benefit. The final blow came as Matthew closed his briefcase. He mentioned casually that the realtor was optimistic about a quick sale. Then he laid down the listing agreement. My home was already on the market. The trap springs shut. Diane handed me a single black suitcase and announced I had 2 hours to pack my entire life into it. Not a discussion, not a suggestion, but a directive delivered with the efficiency of a military operation. She stood in my bedroom doorway with her arms crossed while I stared at the small case that was supposed to contain 71 years of living. The suitcase looked like something you'd take on a weekend trip, not something meant to hold the remnants of a lifetime. Matthew supervised my packing with the detached professionalism of an inventory clerk. He rejected Harold's watch, my wedding album, and most of my books. They allowed 7 changes of clothing, basic toiletries, and 1 small decorative item. I chose the ceramic bowl Harold had made in his pottery class the year before he died. Its imperfect glaze and slightly lopsided shape holding more value than anything else I owned. I'd have traded my 7 outfits for 1 good night's sleep in my own bed, but that wasn't an option they were offering. Michael waited by the front door checking his phone every few minutes, sighing loudly when I lingered over personal items. The furniture Harold and I had saved months to buy, as newlyweds would be sold to strangers. The oak dresser, the antique mirror that had belonged to my grandmother, the rocking chair where I'd nursed each of my babies. Diane assured me the estate sale company would handle everything professionally, as if that somehow lessened the devastation. The ride to Sunset Gardens took 37 minutes through neighborhoods I'd known my entire adult life. I watched familiar landmarks pass by the car window, realizing I might never see them again. The children chatted about traffic and weather while I sat in the back seat clutching my ceramic bowl, feeling like a prisoner being transported to jail. Nobody asked how I felt about leaving my home. Sunset Gardens squatted like a beige brick fortress behind a parking lot full of sedans and medical transport vans. A cheerful sign near the entrance promised, "Your golden years begin here," in colors that felt insulting given the circumstances. The building stretched in both directions, its identical windows staring blindly at the street. The landscaping consisted of precisely trimmed shrubs and decorative rocks, everything designed for efficiency rather than beauty. The lobby hit me with that unmistakable institutional smell, industrial disinfectant mixed with cafeteria food, and something antiseptic that made my stomach turn. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in harsh white light that made everyone look sick and tired. The furniture was designed to be cleaned easily rather than provide comfort. A television mounted high on the wall played a game show that nobody was watching, its canned laughter echoing through the space like mockery. A cheerful woman named Janet welcomed me with practiced enthusiasm, speaking in the loud, slow voice people use with children or the hearing impaired. She explained the facility's schedule and medical protocols while my children nodded approvingly. Janet addressed most of her comments to Matthew and Diane, discussing my care plan as if I wasn't standing right there. When I tried to ask questions, she directed her answers to my children rather than to me. My room was on the 2nd floor, accessible only through locked doors that required staff keycards to open. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with identical doors marked only with room numbers and small nameplates. Room 247 contained a hospital bed, a small dresser, 1 chair, and a narrow closet. The single window looked out over the parking lot rather than the promised garden view Diane had mentioned. The walls were painted institutional beige and decorated with generic landscape prints. Diane unpacked my suitcase with mechanical efficiency, hanging my 7 outfits in the narrow closet and arranging my toiletries on the dresser. She placed Harold's ceramic bowl on the windowsill where it looked lost and out of place against the sterile backdrop. The familiar object that had brought me comfort in my bedroom now seemed like evidence of the life I'd lost. Matthew completed the admission paperwork while Michael paced near the door, obviously eager to leave. They signed documents authorizing medical treatment and approving medication administration on my behalf. I wasn't asked to review or approve anything they signed. Janet explained visiting hours and contact procedures to my children while I sat on the edge of the hospital bed, feeling invisible and irrelevant to decisions about my own life. The moment my children prepared to leave, their relief was obvious and insulting. Diane hugged me quickly and promised to call soon, though her tone suggested duty rather than affection. Matthew shook my hand like we'd concluded a business transaction. Michael kissed my forehead and assured me I'd adjust quickly, his words hollow and rehearsed. I watched from my window as they walked across the parking lot toward their cars, their conversation animated, and their gestures suggesting celebration rather than sadness. They'd accomplished their mission successfully, deposited their inconvenient mother in professional care, and freed themselves to proceed with selling my house. Their quick departure made it clear that my welfare had never been their primary concern. That first night, I lay in the narrow hospital bed, listening to sounds I'd never heard before. Footsteps in the hallway at all hours, the electronic beeping of medical equipment, residents calling out in confusion or distress. The institutional noises replaced the familiar sounds of my neighborhood, the gentle settling of my old house, the rustle of wind through Harold's oak tree. The realization hit me with crushing clarity as I stared at the ceiling tiles. I'd been completely outmaneuvered by my own children, trapped in a place I'd never chosen, stripped of every decision about my own life. They'd executed their plan with ruthless efficiency, while I'd trusted them completely. Every protest I'd raised had been dismissed. Every preference I'd expressed had been ignored. But as I listened to another resident down the hall crying softly in the darkness, anger began replacing my despair. My children had made one critical error in their carefully orchestrated betrayal. As the door clicked shut, I realized they'd made one fatal assumption about me. They'd assumed I was exactly what they'd claimed I was, a confused old woman who would accept whatever they decided for her. Gathering intelligence. The first week at Sunset Gardens, I spent watching and listening, studying the facility like a general surveys enemy territory before battle. The understaffed facility followed predictable routines that created windows of opportunity for unsupervised phone calls, especially during shift changes when chaos reigned and nobody was paying attention to what residents were doing. I befriended Irene Patterson first, a retired literature professor whose daughter had dumped her here after remarrying a younger man who didn't want an elderly mother-in-law around. When I introduced myself, she looked me up and down with sharp eyes and said, "I like you, Marie Wilson. You still have fire in your belly." Irene still possessed the analytical mind that had served her through 30 years of university teaching, and she'd been documenting the facility's violations of state regulations for months. She showed me how to hide notebooks during inspections and taught me which staff members could be trusted with small confidences. "These bastards think we're all senile," she whispered during one of our garden walks. "But some of us are just getting started." Eleanor Richmond became my second ally, a former bank executive whose son had convinced her to sign over financial control after her husband's death. Eleanor had discovered her son was using her retirement funds to finance his gambling addiction, but by then she was trapped at Sunset Gardens with no apparent way to regain control of her money. She understood financial systems and legal documents better than most attorneys, knowledge that would prove invaluable in the weeks ahead. They made one mistake. Eleanor told me during afternoon recreation. They assumed we'd stay quiet about it. Vivian Torres completed our trio, a former civil rights lawyer whose own children had orchestrated her placement at Sunset Gardens after she'd started asking too many questions about their handling of her late husband's estate. Vivian recognized legal vulnerabilities that my children had probably overlooked, and she had the courtroom experience to know which battles could be won. "Honey, they've overplayed their hand," she said after I described the power of attorney document I'd signed. That paper was for medical decisions during recovery, not a license to steal your life. With their skills and my resolve, I wasn't just going to sit here and wait anymore. During my second week, I learned that my children were already showing my house to potential buyers. Barbara Chun, my neighbor for 15 years, called during the facility's afternoon recreation hour when most staff members were busy. She'd seen the real estate signs, the parade of strangers walking through my rooms, and Matthew directing traffic like he owned the place. Barbara's voice shook with anger as she described watching my personal belongings being cataloged by estate sale assessors. The power of attorney document I'd signed after my gallbladder surgery haunted my thoughts, but Vivian's legal analysis offered hope during one of our whispered conversations in the facility's garden. The document I'd signed was specifically for medical decisions during my recovery period. She explained, not a blanket authorization for them to control my entire life. They'd exceeded their authority by making housing decisions and accessing accounts not specifically covered in the original document. I convinced Janet, the social worker, that I wanted to call my children to express gratitude for their loving care. She dialed the numbers for me, believing I was too confused to manage the phone myself. Instead, I called Barbara, using a script I'd rehearsed to sound appropriately addled while conveying critical information. Barbara still had the spare key I'd given her for emergencies, and she agreed to retrieve important documents from my desk while my children were busy with house showings. Playing the role of confused elderly woman required careful performance during my children's visits. I smiled vaguely when they patronized me, nodded agreeably when they discussed my care plan, and acted grateful for their concern about my welfare. Matthew brought forms for me to sign, claiming they were routine facility paperwork, but Eleanor had taught me to read everything carefully. The documents were attempts to expand their power of attorney authority, which I refused to sign by claiming my arthritis made writing too painful. Diane visited with her teenage daughter Emma, my granddaughter, who looked uncomfortable and asked pointed questions about why I was living in such a depressing place. Diane quickly steered the conversation away from my living conditions, focusing instead on my supposed medical needs and cognitive decline. Emma's skeptical expression suggested she wasn't buying her mother's explanations, creating a potential ally I filed away for future consideration. Barbara's intelligence gathering revealed crucial information about my financial situation. My children had access to my primary checking account and savings account at First National Bank, but they hadn't discovered the investment account I'd opened at Hamilton Financial after Harold's death. That account contained nearly $300,000 in municipal bonds and certificates of deposit that matured at different intervals. Barbara also confirmed that my house deed was still in my name alone, despite my children's claims that legal ownership had been transferred to them. Eleanor helped me understand the financial maneuvers my children were attempting. They'd moved money from my savings account to cover Sunset Gardens' monthly fees, but they were also transferring larger amounts to accounts I didn't recognize. When I asked Matthew about these transactions during his next visit, he claimed the money was being invested more aggressively to ensure long-term care funding. His explanations sounded rehearsed and avoided specifics about where my money was actually going. The network of wronged women at Sunset Gardens expanded as I identified others whose families had betrayed them for financial gain. Margaret Hoffman's nephew had convinced her to deed her farm to him for tax purposes, then immediately sold it and pocketed the proceeds. Dorothy Walsh's daughter-in-law had systematically stolen from her checking account for 2 years before orchestrating her placement in memory care. These women possessed decades of professional experience, street wisdom, and burning desire for justice that my children had foolishly ignored. Most importantly, Vivian's legal analysis revealed that they'd failed to petition for guardianship through the courts, meaning I retained legal capacity to make my own decisions and revoke their authority entirely. The power of attorney I'd signed was limited in scope and duration, expiring 6 months after my surgery unless renewed. They'd been operating under false assumptions about their legal authority, and that overconfidence was about to become their downfall. The estate sale company my children hired moved through my house like locusts, pricing and cataloging 46 years of accumulated memories. Barbara provided daily reports about furniture being tagged, artwork being appraised, and boxes of personal items being hauled away. My wedding china sold for $30 to a stranger who probably had no idea it represented months of saving and careful selection by young newlyweds building their first home together. Michael's phone calls became less frequent as he assumed I was settling into facility life without resistance. When he did call, I maintained my performance of grateful confusion while gathering intelligence about their timeline. The house would close escrow within 30 days, he mentioned casually, and the proceeds would be deposited into an account he'd established for my long-term care expenses. His confidence in their successful manipulation was about to become their greatest weakness. The breakthrough came during my 3rd week when I realized my children's fundamental error. They'd focused so intensely on capturing my house and accessing my known accounts that they'd failed to conduct thorough financial discovery. They were so busy dividing assets, they'd found that they'd stopped looking for assets they hadn't found. Their greed had made them careless, and their assumption of my helplessness had made them overconfident. But I'd been documenting everything, and now it was time to act. The facility phones might be monitored, but I'd identified the perfect windows when calls went unrecorded. I had the evidence, I had the allies, and most importantly, I had the legal standing to fight back. My children thought they'd won, but they were about to discover that underestimating Marie Wilson getting access to a phone without staff supervision took careful planning and perfect timing. During the chaos of dinner service, when aides were distracted with feeding residents and cleaning spills, I slipped into the empty activities room, where calls weren't monitored, and dialed the number Vivian had whispered to me during our morning walk. Martin Green had been her law partner for 23 years before she was forced into Sunset Gardens, and he specialized in cases exactly like mine: elder abuse, financial exploitation, and families who preyed on their own parents for profit. Martin's voice was sharp and professional when I explained my situation, speaking quickly during the brief window before someone would notice my absence. He asked precise questions about the power of attorney document, the timeline of my placement, and the financial transactions my children had made without proper authorization. When I described how they'd manipulated my post-surgical vulnerability to gain control over my life, his tone shifted from professional interest to controlled anger. He'd handled dozens of similar cases, and he recognized the pattern immediately. Documentation became my obsession during the following weeks. Every phone call from my children was a chance to gather evidence of their financial scheming. Eleanor taught me how to take detailed notes in a shorthand system that looked like random scribbles to casual observers. I recorded dates, times, and exact quotes from conversations where Matthew discussed real estate transactions and Diane mentioned investment account transfers. Michael's casual comments about dividing my assets provided crucial evidence of their coordinated plan to steal my wealth. The house sale timeline created urgent pressure that made my heart race during sleepless nights. Barbara's intelligence reports revealed that my children had scheduled the closing for the following month, giving me less than 3 weeks to stop the transaction legally. They'd found a buyer willing to pay $890,000, $15,000 above asking price, and Matthew was already talking about how to invest the proceeds. Every day I delayed action was another day closer to losing my home forever. Moving my hidden assets required delicate coordination with Hamilton Financial. I had a separate bond portfolio worth nearly $300,000 they'd never found, money I'd invested after Harold's death that existed completely outside their knowledge. During supervised phone calls, I spoke in code with my account manager, claiming confusion about recent statements while actually providing instructions to transfer funds to a new account with different beneficiaries. Eleanor had coached me on financial terminology that sounded like elderly confusion, but conveyed specific banking instructions to trained professionals. My children's confidence grew visibly during their weekly visits as they assumed their plan was proceeding without obstacles. Matthew brought property management brochures and discussed long-term care insurance policies, treating me like a financial burden to be managed efficiently. Diane talked about cleaning out my closets and donating my clothes to charity, making decisions about my personal belongings as if I were already dead. Michael mentioned taking my car to a dealer for evaluation, planning to sell another piece of my independence. The legal paperwork Martin prepared had to be filed with absolute precision to stop the house sale before the closing date. We scheduled the filing for a Tuesday morning when my children would be at work and unable to respond immediately. The documents included a petition to revoke their power of attorney, an emergency injunction to halt all financial transactions, and formal complaints alleging elder abuse and financial exploitation. Martin warned me that once these papers were filed, the situation would escalate quickly and my children would realize I'd been planning this counterattack. Recording my children's phone conversations required equipment that Irene's grandson smuggled into the facility during a routine visit. The small digital recorder fit inside my ceramic bowl, activated by a simple button press that I could manage without drawing attention. During calls where my children discussed dividing my money and spending my assets, I captured their voices discussing my financial worth like livestock at auction. Their casual conversations about my inheritance while I was still alive provided damning evidence of their mercenary motives. Eleanor's banking expertise proved invaluable when we discovered additional accounts my children had opened using my social security number and personal information. They'd established a checking account for facility payments and a savings account where they were depositing money from my primary accounts. These unauthorized accounts represented clear financial fraud that would strengthen our legal case. Significantly, Eleanor helped me document every transaction and identify patterns that proved deliberate theft rather than legitimate care management. Martin's legal strategy involved challenging multiple aspects of my children's actions simultaneously. The power of attorney document was limited to healthcare decisions during my surgical recovery, giving them no authority to make housing or financial decisions. Their placement of me in Sunset Gardens exceeded their legal authority and constituted false imprisonment. The house sale was being conducted without proper legal authorization, making it fraudulent. Each violation built a stronger case for prosecution and financial recovery. Building anticipation for the legal filing required maintaining my performance as a confused and helpless resident while secretly coordinating with Martin and his legal team. I attended facility activities with vacant smiles, nodded agreeably during medical evaluations, and acted grateful when my children visited with condescending concern. Every interaction was carefully calculated to maintain their false sense of security while I prepared to destroy their criminal enterprise. The legal proceedings began with Martin filing papers in county court on the predetermined Tuesday morning. The emergency injunction request was based on imminent financial harm and elder abuse allegations that required immediate judicial intervention. Martin had prepared evidence packages that included bank records, recorded conversations, and documentation of my children's unauthorized actions. The judge would review these materials and decide whether to halt the house sale pending further investigation. Maintaining my helpless act became even more critical once legal action began, since my children would be notified of the court filings within hours. I needed them to believe I was still the confused elderly woman they'd manipulated, not the sharp-minded strategist who'd been building a case against them. Every conversation required careful performance to avoid revealing my role in the legal challenge they were about to face. The breakthrough moment arrived when Martin called to deliver news that made my hands shake with relief and vindication. The court had reviewed our emergency petition and supporting evidence, recognizing the clear signs of elder abuse and financial exploitation. The judge was reportedly appalled by the circumstances, particularly the fact that I'd been manipulated while under the influence of post-surgical medication when signing the healthcare proxy. Then came the call that changed everything. I'd stopped the sale in its tracks. The tables turned. Matthew's phone rang at 11:30 Tuesday morning while he was reviewing quarterly reports in his corner office. The caller identified himself as a court clerk from the county courthouse, informing him that legal papers had been filed regarding his mother's estate and financial affairs. Matthew's confident demeanor cracked as the clerk explained that an emergency injunction had been issued, immediately freezing all transactions related to his mother's assets. The house sale scheduled for the following week was officially blocked pending judicial review. His hands shook as he hung up the phone and immediately called Diane. Diane was showing a client potential office spaces when Matthew's frantic call interrupted her presentation. She excused herself and stepped into the hallway, where Matthew's panicked voice described the legal bombshell that had just exploded their carefully orchestrated plan. The court injunction named all 3 children as respondents in an elder abuse investigation, and they were required to appear for a hearing within 72 hours. Diane's professional composure dissolved as she realized their scheme had been discovered and legally challenged. Michael received the news while reviewing loan applications at the bank where he worked as a vice president. Diane's call came through on his direct line, her voice high with stress as she explained the legal crisis they were facing. The court had not only stopped the house sale, but also frozen access to their mother's accounts and revoked their power of attorney authority. Michael's colleagues noticed his face drain of color as he absorbed the implications of facing criminal charges for elder abuse and financial exploitation. The emergency family meeting that afternoon took place in Matthew's living room, the same space where they'd celebrated prematurely just weeks earlier. Diane paced frantically while reviewing the legal documents that had been served to each of them. The papers detailed specific allegations of fraud, unauthorized financial transactions, and false imprisonment of a vulnerable elderly person. Michael sat silent in his chair, calculating the potential prison sentences and professional consequences they were facing. Their mother's mental sharpness became impossible to deny when Martin Green called Matthew directly that evening. The attorney's voice was cold and professional as he explained that his client had been fully competent throughout her placement at Sunset Gardens. She had documented their conversations, recorded their phone calls, and gathered evidence of their financial crimes with the assistance of other residents and outside allies. Matthew's assumption that his mother was confused and helpless crumbled as Martin detailed the sophisticated legal strategies she'd orchestrated from her nursing homeroom. The recorded conversations Martin played during their emergency conference call revealed the depth of their mother's deception and planning. Her voice on the recordings was clear, analytical, and completely lucid as she discussed legal strategies with her attorney. She had never been the confused elderly woman they believed they were manipulating. Instead, she had been playing a role while gathering evidence of their criminal behavior. Diane's horror grew as she realized their mother had been several steps ahead of them throughout the entire process. County investigators arrived at Matthew's office Thursday morning with search warrants for his financial records and computer files. The Financial Crimes Unit had been alerted to potential elder abuse involving significant assets, and they were conducting a thorough investigation into the family's actions. Matthew watched helplessly as investigators seized bank statements, real estate documents, and email correspondence that detailed his coordination with his siblings. His colleagues whispered among themselves as investigators escorted him to a conference room for questioning. The evidence trail their mother had documented was comprehensive and damning. Bank records showed unauthorized transfers from her accounts to accounts they'd opened without her knowledge. Real estate documents revealed they'd exceeded their power of attorney authority by listing her house for sale. Recorded phone conversations captured their discussions about spending her money and dividing her assets while she was still alive. Their greed had made them careless about covering their tracks, assuming their mother was too confused to notice or challenge their actions. Martin Green's legal team presented the evidence to prosecutors with recommendations for criminal charges, including theft, fraud, and elder abuse. The case was particularly strong because the children had created extensive documentation of their crimes through their own communications and financial transactions. Their assumption that their mother was helpless had led them to be brazen about their illegal activities, never considering that someone might be watching and recording their behavior. The court hearing revealed the full scope of their mother's legal counterattack. Judge Harrison reviewed the evidence with obvious disgust, commenting that the case represented a particularly egregious example of family members preying on their own parent for financial gain. The power of attorney was immediately revoked. All access to their mother's accounts was terminated, and the house sale was permanently blocked. The judge also issued restraining orders preventing them from contacting their mother or interfering with her affairs. Matthew's corporate position grew precarious as news of the elder abuse charges spread through his company's executive ranks, ultimately costing him his CFO role. Diane's law license faced potential suspension based on ethics violations related to exploiting a family member. Michael's banking career ended when federal regulators learned about his involvement in financial crimes against his mother. With their power stripped, it was clear who held the real power. The confrontation came when their mother called each of them personally from her lawyer's office. Her voice was steady and controlled as she detailed the criminal charges she was prepared to file against them. Financial exploitation of an elderly person carried potential prison sentences of up to 10 years, and the evidence she gathered virtually guaranteed conviction. Her tone was businesslike as she explained their options and consequences with clinical precision. Michael broke first during that final phone call, his voice cracking with tears as he said, "I don't expect forgiveness, Mom. We wanted the money, and we convinced ourselves you needed care. But we knew what we were doing was wrong." His admission hung in the air like a confession that could be used against all of them in court. The final ultimatum arrived via certified mail at each of their homes. The letter detailed exactly how much money they'd stolen, which accounts they'd accessed illegally, and what restitution was required. They had 24 hours to return every penny they'd taken, transfer all financial control back to her, and sign agreements acknowledging their criminal behavior. The alternative was full prosecution with prison sentences that would destroy their lives completely. But their mother had one more surprise waiting for them, something that would determine whether she showed mercy or pursued maximum legal consequences. The decision she was about to make would change everything. The reckoning. Walking out of Sunset Gardens on that crisp October morning felt like resurrection. I carried the same black suitcase my children had packed for me 6 months earlier, but this time I was leaving as a free woman with complete legal control over my life and assets. The autumn air tasted different when you breathed it as someone who owned her own destiny again. Martin Green waited in his silver sedan, engine running, ready to drive me back to the house my children had tried to steal. The nursing home staff watched through the lobby windows as their supposedly helpless resident walked confidently toward her future. Matthew called my cell phone 14 times before noon, his voice messages growing increasingly desperate as reality sank in. The first message was angry, demanding to know how I'd orchestrated the legal challenge without their knowledge. By the seventh message, his tone had shifted to panic as he realized the full scope of criminal charges they were facing. The final voicemail was pure desperation, begging for a meeting to discuss reasonable solutions that would avoid prosecution. His transformation from controlling manipulator to frightened supplicant happened in less than 4 hours. Diane arrived at my house 20 minutes after I did, her usually perfect appearance disheveled and her designer suit wrinkled from a sleepless night of crisis management. She stood on my front porch, the same porch where she'd played as a child, pleading for understanding about their financial motivations. Her law firm had already placed her on administrative leave pending resolution of the criminal charges, and her professional reputation was crumbling as news of the elder abuse case spread through legal circles. She offered to return money immediately if I would agree not to press criminal charges, but her calculations were wildly inaccurate. Michael showed up that evening with his wife, Jennifer, both of them looking like they'd aged 10 years in the past week. Jennifer cried as she explained how Michael's termination from the bank had destroyed their financial security and threatened their mortgage payments. Their teenage children were facing social humiliation as classmates learned about their father's criminal charges through social media posts and local news coverage. Michael stammered through apologies and promises to make restitution, but he couldn't explain where he'd find money to repay what they'd stolen after losing his banking career. The house revealed the extent of their theft when I walked through rooms that had been systematically stripped of valuable items. Harold's antique pocket watch collection was gone, sold to a dealer for a fraction of its appraised value. My grandmother's china cabinet stood empty, its contents liquidated through the estate sale company. The Persian rug from our living room had been replaced with cheap carpeting, probably sold separately for quick cash. They treated my home like a warehouse to be liquidated rather than a repository of family memories and personal treasures. Martin's investigation revealed transactions that exceeded even my worst expectations about their greed. They'd sold Harold's vintage car collection for $38,000, keeping the money rather than depositing it into accounts designated for my care. Diane had taken my jewelry to an appraiser and sold pieces worth over $15,000, claiming she needed immediate funds for my facility expenses. Matthew had liquidated Harold's coin collection and used the proceeds to pay down his own mortgage, treating my assets like his personal inheritance advance. Channel 7 News picked up the story after court documents became public record, turning my family's betrayal into regional headlines about elder abuse and financial exploitation. The reporter interviewed me in my living room, the same space where my children had ambushed me months earlier. I spoke calmly about systematic manipulation and betrayal, while their attorney issued statements claiming misunderstandings and family disputes rather than criminal behavior. The national coverage attracted attention from other elderly victims whose families had exploited them for financial gain. Matthew's corporate position became untenable when the story aired during primetime news slots. His company's board called an emergency meeting to address potential liability from employing someone facing elder abuse charges, and his 20-year rise through corporate ranks ended with a termination letter citing moral turpitude clauses. Diane's legal career disintegrated when the State Bar opened ethics investigations, her law license facing suspension for exploiting a family member. Michael's banking. Industry connections became worthless when federal regulators flagged his involvement in financial crimes against an elderly relative. The restitution demands I presented through Martin's office detailed every stolen item and unauthorized transaction my children had executed. The total exceeded $270,000 when calculated with interest and penalties. Matthew's suburban house went on the market immediately as he scrambled to raise money for repayment. Diane borrowed against her retirement accounts to fund restitution payments. Michael's family sold their vacation property and withdrew their children's college funds to meet court-ordered payment schedules. Letters arrived daily from seniors describing similar betrayals by children and caregivers who'd manipulated their trust for monetary benefit. Many writers had given up hope of recovering stolen assets or achieving justice against their abusers. My legal victory provided them with evidence that fighting back was possible, and that courts would protect elderly victims when presented with clear evidence of abuse. Within 6 months, I personally helped 15 individuals escape similar situations, connecting them with legal resources and emotional support. I'd turned their betrayal into a mission to protect others, just as Irene had urged from day one. The relationships with my children reached a point where legal resolution seemed more important than family reconciliation. Their phone calls alternated between aggressive demands for forgiveness and pathetic pleas for financial mercy. None of them expressed genuine remorse for the betrayal itself, only regret about getting caught and facing consequences. The final confrontation happened in Martin's office when all 3 children signed agreements acknowledging their criminal behavior and agreeing to make full restitution. Matthew's signature was barely legible as his hand shook with stress. Diane wept silently while reviewing the financial terms that would consume her savings for years. Michael stared at the ceiling as he signed away his professional reputation and financial security. Their defeat was complete, their confidence shattered, their futures permanently altered by their own greed. But the house sale marked the foundation of revenge. The $875,000 from my house never went into any care facility account or investment portfolio like my children had planned. Instead, I used every penny to establish the Marie Wilson Foundation for Elder Autonomy, named after myself because I'd learned that sometimes you have to be your own hero. The foundation's mission was simple and devastating for my offspring: provide legal assistance, financial support, and advocacy services to elderly victims of family exploitation. My personal revenge had transformed into something far more powerful than they could have imagined. The foundation's first office opened 6 months after my legal victory in a converted Victorian house 2 blocks from where I'd lived for decades. The symbolism wasn't accidental. I wanted my children to drive past that building every time they visited the old neighborhood, a constant reminder that their greed had created an organization dedicated to destroying people exactly like them. The painted sign out front read, "Elder Justice Legal Aid," in bold letters that were visible from 3 blocks away. Martin Green became the foundation's first legal director, bringing his expertise in elder abuse cases and his network of attorneys who specialized in financial exploitation. We hired 4 additional lawyers within the first year, each one handpicked for their experience prosecuting family members who preyed on elderly relatives. The legal team worked exclusively on contingency basis for clients who couldn't afford traditional attorney fees, funded entirely by the money my children thought they were stealing for themselves. Our intake coordinator fielded over 200 calls during the foundation's first month of operation. Elderly victims from across 3 states contacted us after seeing news coverage about my case and the foundation's establishment. Margaret Williams called about her son, who'd forged her signature on property deeds. Robert Chen's daughter had been systematically draining his retirement accounts for gambling money. Dorothy Walsh's nephew had convinced her to sign power of attorney documents that gave him complete control over her finances and living arrangements. The foundation's investigative unit consisted of retired detectives and forensic accountants who specialized in financial crimes against vulnerable populations. These professionals donated their time and expertise to build cases against family members who exploited elderly relatives. They traced money transfers, documented fraudulent transactions, and gathered evidence that prosecutors needed to file criminal charges. The team operated with surgical precision, knowing that elder abuse cases required overwhelming evidence to overcome family manipulation and victim reluctance. Matthew discovered the foundation's existence when his former colleagues forwarded news articles about our first major victory against a family in Minneapolis. The son had stolen over $400,000 from his 80-year-old mother's accounts while she lived in memory care. Our legal team had not only recovered the stolen funds, but secured a 5-year prison sentence for the perpetrator. Matthew called me that evening, his voice shaking as he realized that his mother's betrayal had created his personal nightmare scenario. Diane's reaction was pure horror when she understood that the foundation actively recruited cases against attorneys who exploited elderly family members for financial gain. Our legal ethics division specifically targeted lawyers who used their professional knowledge to manipulate vulnerable relatives, seeking both criminal prosecution and disbarment proceedings. Diane had escaped prison through our restitution agreement, but hundreds of other attorney children wouldn't be so fortunate. The Foundation's media division produced educational materials about recognizing elder abuse warning signs and legal resources available to victims. We created television commercials that aired during programs popular with elderly viewers, featuring real victims who'd recovered stolen assets through our legal assistance. Each advertisement ended with our phone number and website address, followed by my voice saying, "If your family has betrayed your trust, we're here to help you fight back." Michael's banking industry connections became worthless when financial institutions learned about the Foundation's work exposing family members who manipulated elderly relatives' accounts. We developed relationships with federal regulators who investigated suspicious transactions involving senior citizens. banks now referred potential elder abuse cases directly to our hotline, knowing we had the resources and expertise to pursue criminal prosecution. Michael's expertise in financial services had become a liability rather than an asset in his own career destruction. The foundation's success stories multiplied rapidly as word spread through senior communities about our services. Within 2 years, we'd helped recover over $12 million in stolen assets and secured criminal convictions against 47 family members who'd exploited elderly relatives. One woman from Chicago called me after confronting her son about stealing her pension money. Her voice was shaking with emotion when she said, "Marie, you gave me courage. I never thought I could stand up to him, but your story showed me I wasn't helpless." These victories represented families like mine that had been torn apart by greed and betrayal, but unlike mine, many found ways to heal. Speaking engagements became a regular part of my schedule as the foundation's profile grew nationally. I addressed senior center groups, legal conferences, and legislative committees about the epidemic of family-perpetrated elder abuse. Standing at podiums across the country, I shared my story and explained how children could systematically manipulate parents for financial gain. My children's names never appeared in these presentations, but anyone who researched the foundation's origins would find their criminal behavior documented in court records. Congressional testimony became part of my advocacy work when federal legislators considered strengthening elder abuse prosecution statutes. I sat at witness tables in Washington hearing rooms, describing how families manipulated vulnerable seniors through fraudulent power of attorney documents. The legislation that eventually passed included provisions requiring stricter oversight of these legal instruments, making it harder for families to exploit elderly relatives the way mine had exploited me. The foundation's annual budget grew to exceed $2 million within 3 years, funded through donations from grateful clients, legal settlement fees, and grants from organizations dedicated to protecting vulnerable populations. We opened satellite offices in 4 additional states and employed 32 people whose sole mission was helping elderly victims escape family exploitation. The money my children had stolen to fund their selfish desires had multiplied into resources that helped hundreds of seniors reclaim their lives. My children's betrayal had created something infinitely more powerful than their petty theft. Their greed had transformed a comfortable retirement into a crusade for justice that affected thousands of elderly victims nationwide. Every case we won, every criminal conviction we secured, every dollar we recovered for exploited seniors represented the multiplication of their selfishness into widespread social change. They wanted my money. Instead, they gave me my true purpose. But the foundation was just the beginning of my new life. As I prepared to celebrate my 5th year of freedom, I realized that revenge had evolved into something much more satisfying. Living well is the best revenge. The foundation's success opened doors I never imagined walking through at 76. 5 years after walking out of Sunset Gardens, I wake up every morning in my comfortable apartment, energized by work that transforms personal betrayal into meaningful service for hundreds of seniors annually. My social circle consists entirely of people who value me for who I am rather than what I own. Eleanor lives in the same building after her legal victory against her gambling-addicted son, and we share morning coffee while planning foundation strategies. Vivian joins us for evening discussions about legal precedents in elder abuse cases. These women understand loyalty and friendship in ways my biological children never did, proving that family is defined by behavior rather than blood relationships. The Marie Wilson Foundation operates from a downtown office building where I spend 3 days each week reviewing cases and meeting with clients. Last month, we helped a retired teacher recover $80,000 her grandson had stolen through forged checks. Yesterday, we secured a criminal conviction against a daughter who'd manipulated her father into signing over his farm deed. The work provides purpose and satisfaction that my previous quiet retirement never offered, turning my personal nightmare into meaningful service that protects vulnerable seniors from predatory family members. My speaking calendar stays full with invitations from senior centers, legal conferences, and legislative committees across the country. Standing before audiences of elderly people who've been betrayed by their own families, I see recognition in their eyes when I describe the systematic manipulation my children used against me. These presentations often end with audience members approaching to share their own stories of financial exploitation and family betrayal. The connection we form transcends the typical speaker-audience relationship, creating a network of survivors who support each other through legal battles and emotional recovery. The phone call from Diane came on a Tuesday afternoon in March while I was reviewing foundation financial reports in my office. Her voice sounded smaller and older than I remembered, stripped of the confident professional tone she'd used during her manipulation campaign. She'd been calling for weeks, leaving voicemails that I deleted without listening to completely. This time curiosity made me answer, though I kept the conversation brief and businesslike. She wanted to meet for coffee to discuss our relationship and the possibility of reconciliation after 5 years of separation. Diane's appearance shocked me when we met at a neutral coffee shop downtown. Her designer clothes had been replaced with discount store outfits. Her professional manicure was gone, and gray roots showed through her formerly perfect hair color. The legal career she destroyed through elder abuse charges had never recovered, leaving her working part-time administrative jobs that barely covered basic living expenses. Her marriage had ended 2 years earlier when her husband, tired of the financial stress and social embarrassment caused by her criminal behavior. The conversation revealed her desperation rather than genuine remorse for the betrayal she'd orchestrated. Diane needed money for her teenage daughter's college expenses and hoped I might provide financial assistance since her grandmother's criminal behavior had destroyed the family's ability to pay tuition. She spoke about family bonds and forgiveness while avoiding responsibility for the systematic theft and manipulation she conducted against me. Her request for financial help demonstrated that she still viewed me primarily as a source of money rather than as a person she deeply wounded. Matthew's situation had deteriorated even further according to mutual acquaintances who occasionally provided updates about my children's circumstances. His corporate career never recovered from the elder abuse charges, and he'd been working a series of temporary consulting positions that provided a regular income. His suburban house had been sold to pay restitution, and his family now rented a modest apartment in a less expensive neighborhood. His wife had filed for divorce after 2 years of financial instability and social embarrassment caused by his criminal behavior against his own mother. Michael's banking career remained permanently destroyed by federal regulatory flags associated with his involvement in financial crimes against an elderly family member. He'd attempted to establish an independent financial consulting business, but background checks revealed his criminal history to potential clients who refused to trust someone who'd stolen from his own mother. His family's financial stress had created marital problems, and his teenage children struggled with social embarrassment at school, where classmates knew about their father's criminal charges. The contrast between our lives became starkly apparent during community events where I encountered my children occasionally. I would arrive at charity galas or cultural events dressed appropriately and accompanied by friends who genuinely enjoyed my company. They would appear uncomfortable and poorly dressed, clearly struggling financially while watching their mother thrive, socially and professionally. The role reversal was complete, with them now appearing vulnerable while I projected confidence and success. Awards and honors accumulated as the foundation's impact grew, with recognition coming from legal associations, social work organizations, and government agencies that dealt with elder abuse issues. The National Association of Social Workers presented me with their Lifetime Achievement Award for advocacy work. The American Bar Association honored the foundation with their outstanding public service recognition. These accolades appeared in the same professional publications where my children had once seen their own career achievements celebrated. Thousands of elderly people have contacted the foundation after hearing my story through media coverage or speaking presentations. Many credit my example with giving them courage to challenge family members who were exploiting them financially or emotionally. Letters arrive weekly from seniors who've successfully reclaimed their independence and dignity after being inspired by the legal victory I achieved against my own children. These connections prove that sharing my experience created positive change far beyond my personal situation. The Foundation's work continues expanding as more states recognize the need for specialized legal assistance for elderly victims of family exploitation. We've trained attorneys in dozens of states on effective prosecution strategies for elder abuse cases. Our educational materials reach millions of seniors annually through partnerships with social service agencies and healthcare providers. The impact multiplies yearly as more elderly people learn to recognize warning signs and seek help before family members can completely destroy their independence. Standing at my office window each evening, I reflect on how completely my life transformed after the worst betrayal I could have imagined. The comfortable but limited existence I'd been living was replaced by meaningful work that helps thousands of people annually. The relationships I lost were replaced by connections with people who value integrity and loyalty above financial gain. The security I thought I'd lost was replaced by genuine independence and purpose that no one can take away from me. They tried to bury me. They didn't know I was a seed. What grew from their betrayal exceeded anything they could have stolen from me. And the harvest continues every day through the lives we save and the justice we deliver. But the true measure of victory goes beyond what they lost. The complete transformation of our lives tells the real story. They lost everything they thought they'd won: careers, reputations, financial security, and family relationships. But I gained purpose, independence, and a mission to help others fight back. The Marie Wilson Foundation has helped over 2,000 elderly victims recover stolen assets and prosecute family members who exploited them. If you have elderly relatives, watch for sudden changes in their living situations, unexplained financial transactions, or family members who discourage outside contact. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Remember that it's never too late to fight back and reclaim your life, no matter how hopeless your situation appears. If this story moved you, share it with someone you care about